All right, it's time for one of my favorite segments, the member segment. This week we have Liz Mair, who is a former RNC spokesperson, writer, and consultant. Welcome to the show, Liz. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Can you just tell people a little bit about your personal story? Obviously, it's a little more of a personal interview. We like to bring some of the members on and get to know them a little bit. What's your background beyond some of the highlights that I mentioned there?
Yeah, so I mean, most people do know me as a political consultant. I also got my start originally on the writing side of politics, not on this sort of, actual professional consulting side of politics. So I do less frequently than I should, but I do still write occasionally for the New York Times, Washington Post, Daily Beast, Washington Examiner, a few other places on and off. And I've always appreciated your writing on gun issues. I think that you have been incisive and capable of getting at details that, frankly, I think a lot of people gloss over, either because they're more interested in talking about sort of the cultural aspects of sort of gun rights supporting and gun rights issues, or frankly, because they just don't actually understand guns, which is obviously a common problem that we encounter. And I mean, I've always found that interesting because as somebody who has always been a really strong libertarian, particularly with regard to civil liberties, I have never seen the Second Amendment as different to, say, the First Amendment in that regard. All of them are very important. And I don't think we have a country without defending maximalist civil liberties, all of them. Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I come to all of this from.
I think that's actually a really interesting point there about the civil liberties aspect of the Second Amendment, right? Like, that's one thing I've always tried to get across to other reporters is like, think about this from a perspective of, what if this same law was applied to the First Amendment rights that we have?
Oh, yeah.
Right? And, just to get a frame of reference, at least for how Second Amendment advocates think about this issue, right? And, because I think that's something that just doesn't cross the mind of a lot of people when they talk about guns.
Yeah, no, that's right. But that is very much how I've always thought of it. I mean, to be fair, I did grow up mostly in a household and with grandparents who were respectively originally from Utah and Montana. So not people who were like afraid of guns or hadn't been around guns. My grandparents, when I was a kid, had a house with a bunch of acreage that you could possibly kind of call like a small ranch. There were cattle next to it, mostly dairy cattle, but we did have a couple of steers there. And so, being in that environment, like there were guns around. They weren't AR-15s, they were other guns, and they were used for practical purposes. But I don't tend to come to this from the sort of gun culture side of it. I tend to come to it from the civil libertarian side of it, which is maybe not totally surprising given some of the sort of Mountain West background. And then also, I grew up like in Western Washington State, like in Seattle. I don't think people have the same approach to gun culture that you would find, for example, in the South or the Midwest pretty clearly. But you do have a lot of civil libertarians there. And so that's kind of how I've always regarded these things. Plus, also, I've always been interested in history, as you can kind of see looking at my bookshelf. And to me, people talk a lot in politics about this in terms of not offending constituencies like hunters or fishermen. And I don't know. To me, I just have always looked at this and gone, they didn't write the Second Amendment because they wanted to protect people's ability to hunt deer.
Right.
It was because we actually had to overthrow a government and, not advocating for anybody doing that. But no. That is sort of the historical context. And when you think about the historical context for things like the First Amendment, too, or, frankly, anything else, like a lot of things that are in the Constitution that apply to, warrantless wiretapping, for example, those things are there for a purpose and they still have modern applicability. And I think the idea of rolling them back is actually quite dangerous.
Yeah. And that is an interesting dichotomy, though, right? You see this all the time in our politics where a lot of the focus is put on hunting and, that's not, besides the fact that the trend in gun ownership over the last several decades, especially the last few years, is towards people who are not hunters necessarily. That is much more towards the use of firearms for self-defense or sport shooting. This old way of thinking about it is still so prominent in many elected officials these days, especially in Washington. And you know, the other aspect of it too, of like, you know, you're not. It reminds me a little bit of Guy Benson, who's works at Town Hall, right, and on Fox. I know he's always talked about how he doesn't own guns. This might have changed recently. I should talk to him, actually, go to the range with him. But he lives nearby me here in Virginia, I think. Yeah. And so do you, right? You're in Virginia as well, or in DC?
I used to be in Virginia. I'm actually now in Connecticut. So I do not own guns because it's basically impossible in this state. But yes, I think where you're going with this is that Guy has always been tremendously supportive of the Second Amendment and of gun rights.
Right.
However, he's not like a gun guy. And I would say Guy and I are probably...
Guy is not a gun guy.
Guy is not a gun guy, right. Yeah, I would say Guy and I are probably somewhat similar there. I mean, I enjoy shooting. I also will totally embarrass my mother here and say that I am the member of the family who is definitely the weaker shot. You know, my mom, now her eyes are going a bit, so it's not like she's going to the range and whatnot, but my mom used to be an absolutely amazing shot. So, you know, to the extent that we have anything that's cultural there, it's that my mom definitely used to enjoy going and, you know, shooting some tin cans. Or frankly, one time when we were in Vietnam, we were out by the Viet Cong tunnels, and they had a range there where it was a very long distance range and you could hire a Kalashnikov and shoot it. And my mom did. And she only hired enough where we had 5 bullets. And from, I don't know what distance, I'm not great with distances, but a very far distance, she hit the bullseye 3 times in a row and then passed me the gun. And I just hope to God I didn't like kill somebody's water buffalo or something, you know. I'm a reasonably decent shot, but she's like the person who, if in 1964, when she had graduated from high school, if the job in American Sniper had been available to 18-year-old girls, like definitely the military should have recruited her into that. So, Guy and I are definitely apart from, I would say, people like my mom, and definitely apart from a lot of the people that I think you find in the South and the Midwest for whom this is really cultural, as opposed to more sort of philosophically driven.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? But it's something that isn't talked about a lot, because most people, when you discuss those defending gun rights, they tend to be gun owners or people who are very much really collectors almost, right? I'm sure people would consider me a collector, even though I have a very small number of firearms compared to many other people out there. But you don't hear a lot about people who aren't gun owners but still value the Second Amendment as a civil liberty, even though I think that's probably a significant portion of the population. Because, for instance, you know, there's the AP has, in their most recent poll, identified 46% of Americans say they have a gun in the home. But, you know, Gallup polling shows that, for instance, when it comes to a ban on handguns, you know, 80+% of people oppose that. And so you have a lot of people who don't personally own firearms, but think that people ought to be able to do that.
I think that's right. And I think some of that is people's understanding of their importance when it comes to self-defense, right? I think that you have a lot of women who don't necessarily own a gun, but always want to be in a position where if you start having somebody stalking or harassing you, you're capable of going and getting one. That's certainly something that I've noticed a lot in that sphere. But yeah, I think in general, I mean, Americans do have a different attitude. I'm also British, so I can say Americans have a very different attitude.
Across.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely have a different attitude when it comes to both gun culture and gun rights than what you're going to find in other places. Certainly. And a lot of that is because of our history. And it's not just the, like, you know, we have more recently than, say, my ancestors in Scotland been out in the wilderness in places where, like, you know, hypothetically, you might actually have a large predatory animal come at you and you might actually need to shoot the thing, right? But it is also this, you know, having had the history of overthrowing a government context. And so,
this is a huge,
I don't think anybody intends to do that now. And certainly, you know, I think we all get the point that Joe Biden likes to make when he says, you know, you're not going to be able to take on an F-16. Although I would remind him of the Posse Comitatus Act when he says that. You know, it does.
It's always some of his most disturbing comments, frankly. But
I mean, personally, I'd love to have my own F-16. And, you know,
you can own jets, actually. You can't own like
I think
the
probably
ornaments,
it's a little outside my price range.
Yes, you have to be very
I think that's
rich.
really my major obstacle there is not so much, what Biden's interpretation is on who should have access to what
People
weapons.
think you can own a lot more things than people think you can. You can own howitzers and tanks and jets.
Yeah.
It's not illegal. There's regulations.
We have a friend of a client who has a property, I believe it's in Virginia, possibly in West Virginia now, where yes, in fact, you can go drive the tank around and fire the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of always intended to do it, but
there's a couple places you can rent tanks in the U.S. You can do it in Vegas, actually.
I feel like doing it in Vegas would be a little bit of sort of overload of stimuli.
I mean, you can do anything in Vegas, right?
Well, that's true. That is basically true.
You can fly. I've shot machine guns from a helicopter in Vegas. You can. There's a lot of things you can do that are legal. That
again, these are the kinds of things that 15 years ago I probably would have infinitely more trusted my mother to do while I sat there and watched and just appreciated the spectacle.
Yes. Despite what the president says, you not only could own a cannon during the founding era, but you can own cannons today. They're not even regulated. The black powder cannons.
I live with a Scottish man who is permanently obsessed with the idea of getting a cannon. So every time Joe Biden says that, I get a lot of chat around my living room about that topic.
I think the little soda can cannons are popular. So get at least a little one. They're fun. You got to know what you're doing though. So.
Yeah, no, like I
don't suggest everyone run out and buy their
Blackadder the Third when they have the final duel. Blackadder expects that it's going to be using swords, but no, in fact, he's dueling with the Duke of Wellington using mini cannons. I feel like a mini cannon is definitely what you want.
That's a very British reference right there.
It is. Well, yeah. I mean, he pulls out the stoking, whatever the stoking device is, and says, "What are we going to do? Tickle each other to death?" Right? Yeah, we fight with cannons. So there you go.
But so your work as a consultant actually brings you into some gun related issues as well. I know you're always pitching me on the specifically issues related to Operation Choke Point back when the Obama administration had tried to effectively choke off financial resources to certain industries. And one of those was the gun industry. And you've had some clients affected by that. And it's still an issue today, right? It is. There's a Supreme Court case coming up, right?
It is still an issue in a couple different ways. So over the course of the close to 12 years that I've had my firm, we have worked with 3 of the 4 industries that were really adversely impacted by Operation Choke Point, which really was entities within the federal government going and saying to banks, hey, our guidance is you shouldn't do business with anything that we call a high risk industry. And this is how we're defining those things. And so there were several industries that were really adversely impacted. Gun industry was one. Anybody who was in a gun business really got stamped down on hard. And it was a way of administratively trying to force gun control, right? At the end of the day, if people aren't able to use their bank accounts and aren't able to effect payments, well, probably you're going to have fewer people buying guns, right? Or at least if they're doing it, they're going to have to find some other very complicated alternative mechanism. So in general, that would stem it. That was the idea, I think. But also that effort did target marijuana businesses, including legal marijuana businesses, medical cannabis research, those kinds of things. I've heard plenty of stories from people who are on that end of it who were affected by it. It also affected sort of fintech. People say payday loans, but in actual fact, I think it was quite a bit broader than that. And people who would consider themselves to be outside the payday loan space, but also were not like, Jamie Dimon, obviously. It also affected what we will call the adult entertainment industry. That's the one that we haven't worked with. But when we were doing a lot of work, when I was pouring through countless documents that I was uncovering in 2013 about this, a lot of it was that. And, at the end of the day, people may not like porn. They may not like guns, but both of them are legal. And actually, if we're going back to the point about constitutional protections, if you're treating porn as generally information and speech, and I think that there's pretty good precedent for doing so, then there are protections in place there. And certainly with regard to guns, there are protections in place there too. And nobody has just straight outlawed, a whole range of the fintechs that were affected. So,
Yeah.
you've got that as well. And marijuana is a little bit more of a gray area, depending on what laws you're looking at. But certainly, there are plenty of legal businesses that operated in that space that were affected. And still, I would add, to this day, they believe that since Trump left office, they have seen more problems accessing the banking system and the financial services sector. So while I can't
we've reported on some of that with the
so I can't
businesses.
definitively show like who's doing that and exactly how that's happening, but I will tell you, I mean, I have one friend, for instance, who invested, I believe it was $10,000 in a completely legal, like obviously legal cannabis business. And literally right after wiring the money, magically his bank account was shut with no explanation, and no explanation has ever been provided. So,
that's similar to what happened to Brand Wexler at Wex Gunworks down in Florida.
Right. Well, I was going to say, and so, that's the other thing is that we see when you look at Florida and a lot of what Ron DeSantis has been talking about doing recently. Okay, Wells Fargo says that they were not pressured to close that account and that it wasn't the result of any sort of government action. Maybe it's just the wokes putting pressure. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But it sure looks like a redux of choke point to me. It sure does. And when you couple it with what the cannabis businesses have said that they've been dealing with in the Biden era, the experience of my friend, I will not be very surprised if we find out that some financial regulator out there is up to this again.
Right, because choke point wasn't out in the open.
It's not FDIC, but it could be. Yeah.
Choke point wasn't something that happened in the open. It was a scandal that broke, without it wasn't publicly released. It was exposed and through a series of stories.
No, it was very hush hush. And I can tell you, as the person who was pitching a lot of that information and trying to break the story, it was incredibly hard to get people to write about it. People were very incredulous that even the Obama administration, with their attitude towards things like guns, could possibly be doing this. I think partly because it targeted the cannabis industry, and people were like, well, why would Obama do that? I mean, he's famous for being a pot smoker, like in high school or college or whatever, right? But in actual fact, yes. And we did a lot of digging, and ultimately that was proven. So, yeah, I mean, I certainly hope it's not happening again. But
you think this Supreme Court case here that we're seeing against the Consumer Financial Protection Board and how it's funded and some of the questions over the constitutionality of its funding might have an effect on FDIC as well, which was the entity that was more involved in choke point?
Correct. I mean, that seems to be the legal consensus, is that if the Supreme Court decides that the CFPB is illegally funded, that the funding structure is simply not compatible with the Constitution, legal experts are saying that then throws up a lot of questions about FDIC too. And so one of the things that I think that naturally sort of lends itself to as a question is, if FDIC is dabbling again in this sort of choke point type thing, which, to be fair, they certainly shouldn't be, A, because they shouldn't be, but B, because they actually did settle with, I think it was more the payday guys on that, and issued a bunch of guidance. Personally, I don't think the wording on that was as tight as what I would have liked to see, but whatever, it could still offer them some latitude. But yeah, if we're in a situation where CFPB, its funding stream is deemed to be unconstitutional, that would raise issues for FDIC too. And so to the extent that they may still sort of have their fingers in these pies, that would probably present a mechanism for shutting it down, which is something that I think a lot of people who are concerned about the possible ongoing continuance of Operation Choke Point, but in a slightly different format, they are very concerned about that, because we've had a situation where things like the Safe Banking Act that keeps being brought up, that would contain a legislative bar, a firm legislative ban on anybody doing anything like choke point ever again. And unfortunately, that hasn't actually made it into law. It would be helpful if it did. It would be better if that was the way that we handled this, rather than, FDIC sort of ending up being gutted by virtue of CFPB litigation.
Yeah.
But yeah, this case definitely is germane to the subject of choke point and whether anything like that could ever happen again.
Well, we will have to see how that all turns out. It sounds like there could be some pretty wide-reaching consequences from this ruling, and some that might affect how the gun industry does its banking. But thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. I always enjoy having on different members, because I think we have a pretty good variety of people, high-powered consultants and commentators like Mary Catherine Ham came on recently. Yep. And then, we have a lot of staffers on the Hill who are members. We have people all around the country who are just gun owners that are interested in the latest gun politics news. And so I like to try and get to know some of those people and have the whole community get to know a little bit better each other. So I really appreciate you being willing to come on and tell us a little bit about yourself and everything that's going on with you.
Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the work that you do. And, I've been glad to see you on TV more. I think it is super helpful every time that we have one of these mass shooting incidents. I think it is super helpful to have somebody like you come on and just do some of the basic fact checking and debunking. Like I say, I am not the world expert on guns. I do not own 8 AR-15s. I'm never going to own 8 AR-15s. But I think the level of misinformation that exists out there, amongst other things, if people go ahead and try to draft legislation, that is going to be very difficult because there are a lot of people who just don't understand basics about what they would be legislating on. And so I think that you guys provide a really valuable service. Yeah.
And I appreciate whenever they have me on, and I'm hoping to expand as much as possible the story types that CNN is bringing on as far as guns. There's obviously, it's important to cover those sorts of shootings, but there's a lot of other stuff going on with guns as well as we cover here on the podcast. Yeah. And so that's always been one of my top priorities.
And I think that possibly, 2024 may present an opportunity to do so. Mm-hmm. I think as I've said pretty publicly, as things stand in a contest that I anticipate being Donald Trump versus Ron DeSantis, I've always believed that Donald Trump has a lot of problems from where I sit on gun rights issues. I think he's a gun grabber. I think he is. He may culturally appeal to gun owners, but I think philosophically he's way far off of where Second Amendment defenders are. I think Ron DeSantis is much better. But I would also say, as somebody who occasionally is just a tad to the right of like the actual NRA, I did find it very interesting recently when I was getting emails from the GOA criticizing him over his position with regard to guns at political or campaign or gubernatorial events. And so I think that there right there may present an opportunity for you to get out and sort of educate people more and potentially have a more rational, informed discussion about all of this.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that was the main topic of the interview with Charles on this episode. So there's a lot going on with guns. DeSantis is pushing a couple of pro-gun reforms, permitless carry, and the one that, this banking bill that you mentioned earlier in this interview. Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of interesting stuff shaping up for the Republican primary when it comes to guns, because I think he is really trying to shore up his right flank on the issue because he needs some accomplishments on that front, right? If he wants to do well in the Republican primary. So there's a lot.
I certainly hope on the banking reform stuff that he makes some noise about that, because I think people are not terribly conscious of the fact that these problems are continuing to persist. And I think it's important that people get to the root of why. Maybe it is not to do with federal government action, but it sure smells a lot like it is. And if it's just an issue of, people pressuring banks, then that's useful to know too.
Yep. But we'll have you on again for a full interview down the line to talk more about the politics of the Republican primary, because I think that's going to be something we follow very closely here.
I would love to. And I suppose soon we'll probably have at least a couple other candidates in, although I suspect it'll be more the sort of Mike Pompeos of the world. And I don't know. Good luck.
It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see who all gets in. And I mean, DeSantis isn't actually in yet either. So we'll see.
No, he's not. Although I'm expecting right around Memorial Day weekend, we're going to get the big announcement. So we'll see. He's got to get to the Florida legislative session first. Like you say, he has a few areas where now that he's succeeded in turning Florida red, now he has to implement some policy that really accords with that so that he has a record to run on that is more in keeping with a lot of his rhetoric.